And I'd like to invite Isaac Berry. Isaac in English. I've prepared. Okay, and so Isaac has been on the sales and business development side of things for the last almost 20 years, I think. Involved in many industrial endeavors in Israel, many startup companies and technologies, and he's going to tell us about small nation, big promise. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see if this works. Lovely. Thank you very much. Welcome to Israel for all the guests, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here. I work today in a research company that actually looks after financial institutions, and my job is to work with managers at financial institutions and understand together with them how, for example, a bank, which is pretty much conservative, and we want it to be conservative with our money, can take innovative ideas and develop an innovation strategy and actually make it work in all the different parts of the organization to help it make better business and to help it keep our money in a better way. But this is not what I'm going to talk about today. What I will try and talk about is give you a little bit of a different angle view of Israel. What do we do here? What seems to be working well? Why the startup nation is such a notion that is so apparent in the way you think about Israel and you look for cooperation with us. And as was just presented, part of the things that build the potential for better cooperation between Tsinghua and Tel Aviv University, but also between Israel as a country and China as a country and a market and a business place. So I gathered a few bits and pieces of facts from different sources, some from the OECD, some from other organizations, to try and map what is basically Israel and how a small nation like Israel, like Mr. Trifos presented earlier on, is so, I would say, has such a big effect on many issues that are worldwide, on many business issues that are worldwide in their way of touching people and lives in so many areas. So just a small example, since 2010 Israel is a member of the OECD, and the Secretary General, Mr. Angel Gurria, when he was here and met the Israeli cabinet ministers, what he basically had to say, as you see, is they understand that there is something in Israel that make us in an OECD way of looking at things special, with growing faster rates, lower deficit, and something is going on here that needs to be analyzed, and they want to learn what to do with it. So let's go and see some interesting facts about Israel, none of them related to nanotechnology or nanoscience or academia at all. But I think they give you a little bit of understanding what happens here in Israel as a nation and how we behave as a society and as an economy. Israel is actually today the only country in the world that has more trees in the 21st century than 100 years ago. In all the countries in the world, they're cutting trees. Israel has more trees. And this is something that I live in the countryside, so I have trees in my garden. It's something I like. I think it represents a lot of the way we understand the place we live, as was described earlier on, with the back to the wall, how we treat our land, how we treat nature, and how it affects our lives. Israel has more museums per capita than any other country in the world. This is the way we teach our children about our history, about our values, about different areas of life that affect what we do. And of course in Israel, and this is relevant to academia, has more books published per capita than any other country in the world. Still today. And this is just 3 facts that are very simple, but I think give you a little bit of an understanding how things are done here. If I go a little bit into numbers, stuff that the OECD likes, and these are numbers published by the Bank of Israel, if you look at Israel today, at least the numbers seem promising. The GDP per capita in Israel today is, I think, $37,000, which is very high. The growth rate is substantially higher than other OECD countries and the Eurozone. The growth forecasts are higher, the unemployment is lower, and actually the things that I think are really interesting is that the debt to GDP ratio in Israel is significantly lower than other OECD countries, and definitely from Europe. I don't know what's the situation in China today, but at least putting Israel as a small country in a very competitive situation, looking into business worldwide. And these are the interesting numbers to look at. A little bit about research, because this is what we are talking today. These are things that I think you already know. Israel has more scientists, engineers, and PhDs per capita than any other country in the world. Israel has the largest amount of startups in nominal numbers in the world, not just per capita, of course, per capita, scientific papers, of course. And one of the things that are interesting, if you look at leading corporations in the world, a big part of them have research agencies or research offices in Israel, develop products here, do scientific research. Some of these companies, the only place in the world where they do research outside the US, for example, is here in Israel. Some of them were very innovative. So this started already in the 70s and in the 80s, and it just intensifies with the year. And this is also one of the things that, at least in my opinion, is important to develop in China. It's not only the academic world, but as was mentioned before, if there are no links to the business environment, to the industry, and to other parts of society, then we will not be doing our job correctly. We need to look at these things as well. I think, Yael, you mentioned water before. Again, an issue of being with the back to the wall. Israel is a country that lives in desert. There are no natural water resources here, or they are very scarce. Some of the things that happened in the last 10 years is that desalination technology and methodology was developed very strongly in Israel. Actually, today, Israel is considered one of the leading countries in the world in terms of seawater desalination. I think the number is over 40%. Over 40% of potable water today in Israel comes from desalination plants, and that will intensify. And although we live in a desert and have the perception of not having water, Israel actually has 8% surplus of water. That was the number last year. So there's actually more than enough water here, as the technology and the relevant science and the relevant methodology was developed to build these sort of plants. But the most interesting number, in my opinion, is this one. 92% of wastewater in Israel is treated, which is a very high number compared to any country in the world. But the really interesting issue is that 75% of sewage water is treated and used for agriculture. And there is no other country in the world that is even close to these numbers. And it relates to what Mr. Trifus described earlier with the defense industry, is how taking the specific circumstances that we have here and using or providing people with the free spirit and the place and the space to think differently and actually do things that are not done in such a way in any other country. So I looked at some of the statistics on this issue. The second country in the world is Australia. They get to 22% of using treated sewage water in agriculture. Look at the gap between them. So Israel is definitely leading in that area, and it has been the case for many a year. We talk about energy. As you know, there's a lot of fuss about energy, about gas as a natural resource today. Not only in the Mediterranean, it's practically something that's happening all around the world. But as we discussed before, Israel has put a target to become energy independent in the next few years. And basically in 7 years' time, we're expected to actually be a reseller of natural gas to other countries. And this goes together with a national program for energy efficiency that the Ministry of Energy is running, and basically making Israel not only a place that makes money from natural resources that provide energy, but a location for industry which is energy hungry to be developed. And that was never the case in Israel. We were just not able to use or to develop these sorts of industry. And today, this is something that is possible together with these new developments in this area. So again, it's a new area of industry that I'm sure will make a lot of new technology, innovation, advancement possible. A little look into the future, which is always important. Again, some statistics that might seem meaningless but are very important, at least when I look at them. The talent age group, what I was many years ago, of between 20 to 34, is a strong indicator of economic growth and is looked at in many, many countries. So Israel is today one of the only countries, members in the OECD, where this talent age group is actually growing, and in the next 15 years it's expected to grow by over 23%, which is a very good indicator to all those cultural, social, society issues that affect the ability to innovate and to work differently. Again, just a simple statistic about our children. This is different scientific Olympiads that have taken place in 2013 with high school kids around the world. And this is just a list of medals that Israel brought in. So we're just actually making sure that the next generation and our kids today are already looking into these areas to make sure this innovation spirit develops. And then the last thing I want to tell you basically summarizes what I had to say to you and summarizes a lot of the things that were said earlier on throughout the day. There are many, many, many reasons why developing with Israel is beneficial for Israel and for China. Not only this cooperation, this very important cooperation between Tsinghua and Tel Aviv University, but around that, in society, in business, in different areas of our lives, where we can bring in what we have studied and China can bring in your resources, what you have studied, your market, your ability, and together basically make a better place for all of us to live in and raise our children. So thank you very much.